This is a summary of Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, published in the autumn of 1790. It is not a systematic treatise, but a long letter, cast in an intimate and personal form, and addressed to a young French gentleman at Paris who had written to ask for Burke's opinion of the great events unfolding across the Channel. Burke tells us in his prefatory note that he had begun a first, shorter answer sometime in October of 1789, but had held it back upon prudential considerations. A renewed and pressing application from his correspondent then drew from him this far larger reply. He kept the form of a letter even as the argument swelled far beyond the measure of a letter into a book. What follows traces Burke's argument in the order in which he made it, in his own terms, and, wherever his phrasing is most telling, in his own words. Part 1. The Occasion, and the Societies in London. Burke opens by explaining why he is not, as his correspondent had assumed, among the English admirers of the French Revolution. The assumption had arisen because two political clubs in London had lent the Revolution their public sanction, and Burke's correspondent supposed that so prominent a man might share their view. Burke insists that he belongs to neither society and speaks only for himself. The first, the Constitutional Society, of some 7 or 8 years, standing, he dismisses almost with a shrug as a poor charitable club that had done little beyond circulating books few people praised. The second, the Revolution Society, is the true object of his attention. It had been formally honored by the French National Assembly, and it was now behaving, in Burke's memorable phrase, as a committee in England for extending the principles of the National Assembly. Its members were accustomed to meet on the anniversary of England's own revolution of 1688, to hear a sermon and then dine together at a tavern, but on this occasion they had gone much further, issuing a congratulatory address, conveyed through Earl Stanhope, that endorsed the proceedings of the French Assembly. Burke objects strongly to the manner of it. An address of this kind, dressed up so as to appear to carry the authority of the English nation, when in fact it expressed the opinion of a small club, has, he says, very much the complexion of a fraud. Before he goes further, Burke is careful to define the sort of liberty he honors, so that he cannot be mistaken for an enemy of freedom itself. He professes a warm love for what he calls a manly, moral, regulated liberty, but he refuses to praise liberty considered in the abstract, stripped of every relation, in all the nakedness and solitude of metaphysical abstraction. Everything, he insists, depends upon circumstances. In one of the book's guiding sentences, he writes, "Circumstances, which with some gentlemen pass for nothing, give in reality to every political principle its distinguishing color and discriminating effect." To congratulate France upon its new liberty, before one knew how that liberty was actually being used, would be, he says, as absurd as to congratulate an escaped madman on his recovered freedom of movement, or to congratulate a highwayman and murderer who has broken out of prison. Liberty, when men act together in bodies, becomes power, and prudent men, before they applaud, wait to see what use is made of that power. The immediate spark of the whole controversy was a sermon. On the forenoon of the 4th of November, 1789, Dr. Richard Price, a dissenting minister of some eminence, had preached at the meeting-house of the Old Jewry a sermon in which, Burke says, the revolution in France is the grand ingredient in the cauldron. It was out of this sermon that the Revolution Society's address to the National Assembly had grown, and printed together with it were letters from the Duc de Rochefoucauld and the Archbishop of Aix. Burke likens the political preaching of Dr. Price to that of the Reverend Hugh Peters in the England of the 1640s, whose zeal helped bring a king to the scaffold, and he complains that politics and the pulpit are terms that have little agreement. The particular doctrine that alarmed him was this. Price had told his hearers that the King of England was almost the only lawful king in the world, because he was the only one who owed his crown to the choice of his people. In that single claim, Burke detects the dangerous seed of the entire affair, and he devotes the first great movement of the book to rooting it out. Part 2. The True Meaning of 1688. Dr. Price had claimed that by the principles of the Revolution of 1688, the people of England had acquired 3 rights. First, the right to choose their own governors. Second, the right to cashier them for misconduct. And third, the right to frame a government for themselves. Burke sets himself to demolish what he scornfully calls this new and hitherto unheard of Bill of Rights. The great body of the English people, he insists, utterly disclaim these supposed rights. They belong only to Price and his small faction. His method throughout is to return to the actual historical documents rather than to reason from abstract principle. The real principles of 1688, he argues, are to be found in the Declaration of Right, the statute of the first year of William and Mary, which he calls the cornerstone of our Constitution. That act, he shows, bound together the rights of the subject and the succession of the crown indissolubly, and it contains not one syllable in support of a right to choose or to cashier the nation's governors. The English of that generation, he argues, did not in any real sense choose William. They were driven by necessity to accept him, having first intended the crown for Mary, the daughter of James. The setting aside of the strict order of succession in favor of William was, Burke freely concedes, a small and a temporary deviation from the hereditary principle. But a deviation forced by dire necessity is precisely not a precedent for ordinary times, and he quotes the maxim that such a special privilege does not pass into a general example. Lord Somers, the great Whig lawyer who drew up the Declaration of Right, had taken deliberate pains, Burke notes, to veil this momentary break in the continuity of the crown, echoing the careful language of earlier declaratory statutes under Elizabeth and James. Burke aligns himself squarely with this cautious tradition. I never desire, he writes, to be thought a better Whig than Lord Somers. Upon this reading of history, Burke builds his central positive doctrine, that the English hold their whole constitution as an inheritance. The Parliament of 1688, he argues, possessed the physical power, but not what he calls the moral competence to abolish the monarchy or to render the crown elective. James II, in one of Burke's crispest formulations, was a bad king with a good title, and not an usurper. And even his removal was justified only because he had, in effect, made war upon the Constitution. The House of Brunswick, likewise, came to the throne, not by election, but by the law, through the statute settling the crown upon the Electress Sophia, a granddaughter of James I through Elizabeth, Queen of Bohemia, and upon her Protestant descendants, so that, in Burke's phrase, the inheritable principle survived with a sort of immortality. The English, he writes, wished at the period of the Revolution, and do now wish, to derive all we possess as an inheritance from our forefathers. They are resolved, he says, not to inoculate any scion alien to the nature of the original plant. He appeals in support to the whole chain of English constitutional documents, Magna Carta, the Charter of Henry I, the Petition of Right under Charles I, and to the great authorities of Coke, Blackstone, and Selden, contrasting throughout the concrete rights of Englishmen, claimed as a patrimony handed down through generations, with the abstract rights of men, proclaimed by Price at home and by the Abbé Sieyès in France. An inherited constitution, Burke argues, furnishes at one and the same time a sure principle of conservation and a sure principle of transmission, while never excluding a principle of improvement. It binds the impersonal machinery of the state to what men actually love, to our dearest domestic ties, to our hearths, our sepulchres, and our altars. And lest he be thought a mere enemy of all change, he lays down the balancing maxim that a state without the means of some change is without the means of its conservation. Burke then takes the three claimed rights and answers them one by one. As to the right to cashier kings for misconduct, in 1688, he points out, the nation did not charge James merely with misconduct, but with a settled design to subvert the Protestant church and state, and with having thereby broken the original contract between king and people. The revolution was intended, in his fine phrase, to make the revolution a parent of settlement, and not a nursery of future revolutions. The removal of a king, he argues, is no matter of routine grievance. It can seldom be accomplished without force, and so becomes in truth a case of war, to be justified only by extreme necessity. A revolution, he writes, will be the very last resource of the thinking and the good. As to the third and boldest claim, the right to pull down and frame a wholly new government from first principles, Burke recoils in open horror. The very idea of the fabrication of a new government, he declares, is enough to fill us with disgust and horror. He then turns the whole argument upon France. France, he says, possessed in some parts the walls and in all the foundations of a noble and venerable castle. It might have repaired its ancient constitution as one restores a great old building, keeping the sound foundations and mending only what was decayed. Instead, he tells his correspondent in a reproach that echoes through the book, "You began by despising everything that belonged to you, You set up your trade without a capital. France might have secured for itself a free constitution, a potent but limited monarchy, a disciplined army, and a reformed and venerated clergy. It chose instead the path of total demolition and embraced what Burke calls the monstrous fiction of a leveling equality that flatters the low while it can never raise them. Burke deepens this argument by pointing to the two great crises of English history in which the nation had faced the choice between demolition and repair. At both the Restoration of 1660 and the Revolution of 1688, he says, the people worked by the two principles of conservation and correction, keeping the ancient frame of the state while mending only the part that had gone wrong. Reform, in his account, must be confined to the peccant part only. One does not pull down the whole house because a single room needs repair. Even after so violent a break as the Norman conquest, he notes, the disputes over the succession had always been resolved so that the inheritable principle survived unbroken. This is why he can insist that the English Constitution is at once stable and capable of growth. It changes as a living body changes, replacing its parts without ever losing its identity. He is equally insistent that the French had a genuine third path open to them. Between the two despotisms they seem to imagine are the only choices. There is, he argues, no need to choose only between the absolute rule of a single monarch and the absolute rule of the multitude. There lies between them the whole tempered ground of mixed and balanced government, in which no single power is left without a check. He recalls the ancient warning, which he traces to Aristotle, that an unmixed democracy bears a close and dangerous resemblance to tyranny, and can oppress a helpless minority more cruelly than any single scepter, precisely because it feels no shame and fears no reckoning. A monarchy tempered by settled orders and independent bodies, he suggests, grafts far more happily onto a free people than the bare and jealous republic the Assembly was erecting. Part 3. Against the Rights of Men. Burke now confronts the guiding philosophy of the Revolution head-on, and he begins by looking closely at the men who were to remake France. He examines the composition of the National Assembly and finds it, for so vast a task, alarmingly unfit. Of the 600 members of the Third Estate, a majority, he observes, were practitioners of the law, and not the leading figures of the profession, but for the most part obscure provincial advocates, men unused to anything beyond the small business of country courts. To these were joined physicians and dealers in stocks and public funds. Such men, Burke argues, lifted suddenly from narrow circumstances into the exercise of sovereign power, would inevitably be intoxicated by it, and would have every temptation to overturn a settled order in which they had counted for little, and to build a new one in which they would count for everything. Against this ambition of the abstract and the distant, he sets his affection for the small and the near. To be attached to the subdivision, he writes in one of his most quoted sentences, "To love the little platoon we belong to in society is the first principle, the germ, as it were, of public affections." Love of one's whole country, in Burke's psychology, grows outward from love of what lies close at hand. It cannot be manufactured out of general propositions. He is at pains, however, not to be misunderstood as denying that men have rights at all. He acknowledges plainly what he calls the real rights of men, the right to justice, to the fruits of one's own industry, to the acquisitions of one's parents, to instruction in life, and to consolation in death, and to a fair share of all that society, by its combined skill and force, can do on a man's behalf. What he denies is that men have an equal right to power, or to a share in the direction of the state. In this partnership, he writes, all men have equal rights, but not to equal things. Government, he defines, in a sentence that stands at the very heart of the book. Government is a contrivance of human wisdom to provide for human wants. And because human wants are many, complex, and often in conflict, the science of government cannot be settled in advance by pure reasoning. It is, he insists, an experimental science, not to be taught in a hurry, and one that a wise man will not venture to remodel merely because he has found some defect in it. He distrusts nothing so much as what he calls the simplicity of contrivance in new constitutions, the neat, symmetrical scheme that looks perfect upon paper, for the very simplicity that recommends it to the theorist is a sign that it has ignored the real complexity of human life, and it is likely to prove monstrous in operation. Burke closes this movement by returning to Dr. Price. He quotes the preacher's rapturous words from the pulpit. "I have lived to see 30 millions of people spurning at slavery, and rejoicing to have seen their king led in triumph." Burke reads this exultation with something close to disgust. The King of France, he insists, had not been led in triumph as a victorious general is led, amid the joy of his people. He had been dragged as a captive amid the threats of a mob. The assembly itself, Burke reminds his reader, was at that very moment deliberating under the terror of the bayonet and the lamppost, in the presence of a captive king, a body possessing, in a Latin phrase he borrows, neither the color of lawful authority nor the grave dignity of a true senate. This bloody reality, and not the preacher's rapture, is what Burke turns to next. Part 4. The 6th of October and the Fall of Chivalry. Here, Burke reaches the emotional center of the whole book, his set-piece account of the events of the 6th of October, 1789, when a Parisian mob marched out to the Palace of Versailles and forced the royal family back to the capital. He describes the queen roused from sleep and forced to flee, almost naked, the murder of a sentinel at her door, and the royal family carried off to Paris, to what he calls a Bastille for kings. He refuses to be shamed out of his own feeling by the fashionable philosophy of the day. Being, as he says, unenlightened by a single ray of this new-sprung modern light, he confesses without apology that the rank, the sex, and the beauty of the sufferers and the tender age of the royal children heighten rather than lessen his grief. He praises the fortitude of the king on that shameful occasion, and the Roman dignity of the queen, whom he imagines carrying, in the classical manner, the means of an honorable death concealed about her rather than survive dishonor. Then comes the most famous passage in the work, and perhaps in all of Burke. He recalls having seen Marie Antoinette at Versailles some 16 or 17 years earlier, when she was still the Dauphiness, glittering like the morning star, full of life and splendor and joy. He had thought, he says, that 10,000 swords must leap from their scabbards to avenge even a look that threatened her with insult. But the age of chivalry is gone, he writes. That of sophisters, economists, and calculators has succeeded, and the glory of Europe is extinguished forever. For Burke, chivalry was no mere decorative survival. It was the mixed system of opinion and sentiment bred over centuries that had distinguished the civilization of Europe from that of Asia and of the ancient world. It had, in his account, mitigated kings into companions, and raised private men to be fellows with kings. It had subdued the natural fierceness of power, not by law alone but by manners, and it had produced a noble equality that ran through all the gradations of social life without confounding them. It was, in his phrase, the unbought grace of life, the cheap defense of nations, and its loss he treats as a catastrophe for the whole of Europe. The Revolution, Burke argues, threatens to strip away every one of these sustaining sentiments in the name of reason. Its new conquering empire of light and reason, he warns, would dissolve all the pleasing illusions which made power gentle and obedience liberal. In one of his most quoted images, all the decent drapery of life is to be rudely torn off, and man is to be left shivering in his naked nature, robbed of what he calls the wardrobe of a moral imagination that once clothed and dignified him. Under the new dispensation, he warns, a king is but a man, a queen is but a woman is but an animal not of the highest order, and so the crimes of regicide and sacrilege shrink into mere common homicide. This barbarous philosophy, which he calls the offspring of cold hearts and muddy understandings, leaves the law of the state resting upon nothing but naked terror, and he gives the terror an image that has never been forgotten. In the groves of their academy, at the end of every visto, you see nothing but the gallows. From this Burke draws his great argument about manners. Manners, he insists, are in the end more important than laws, for it is upon manners that the working of the laws depends, and it is manners that make a country worth loving. To make us love our country, he writes, our country ought to be lovely. When manners are destroyed, power does not vanish. It survives, but by baser means, so that kings will be tyrants from policy, he warns, when subjects are rebels from principle. European civilization, he argues, has rested upon two great principles working together, the spirit of a gentleman and the spirit of religion. and it was the nobility and the clergy who between them had kept learning and manners alive. Let learning cut itself loose from these supports, and aspire to rule alone, and it will, in his most notorious and bitterly resented image, be, quote, cast into the mire, and trodden down under the hoofs of a swinish multitude. He compares his own steadiness to the theater, arguing that a true tragic audience watching kings hurled from their thrones is purified by terror and pity into a right feeling that Price's cold political calculation has entirely lost. No audience, he says, would tolerate a leading actor coolly weighing so much actual crime against so much contingent advantage, in the manner of the Revolution's bookkeepers of politics. Burke presses the point that Dr. Price's exultation had rested on a false picture of the deposed king. Price had rejoiced to see an arbitrary monarch humbled. But the reign of Louis XVI, Burke objects, had in truth been a series of concessions, a steady loosening of the reins rather than a tightening of them, and it is a strange justice that reserves its severest treatment for the mildest of rulers. He distinguishes sharply between misfortune and crime, where there are real tyrants to be punished, and history furnishes them from Nero and Agrippina to the murderous princes of a later age. Justice, he insists, must still be grave and decorous, carried out with the solemnity of law, and not with the glee of a mob, for a people that learns to take pleasure in the degradation of the great will soon lose all reverence for anything whatever. He allows himself, too, a sardonic glance at the English slanderers of the French Queen, recalling Lord George Gordon, the man who had raised an anti-Catholic mob in London, and now sat in the rebuilt Newgate prison, a convert to Judaism. Burke offers, with heavy irony, to make an exchange of fanatics between the two nations. The joke has a serious purpose, to show that England has its own zealots in its own follies, and is in no need of importing the abstract enthusiasms of Paris. It is upon the two great principles of the spirit of a gentleman and the spirit of religion. He repeats that the civilization of Europe has rested. Strip these away, and even commerce and trade, which the new philosophers so admire, lose the shade under which they had quietly grown. Part 5. Prejudice and Religion as the Basis of Society. Burke is anxious that his French correspondent should not mistake the noise of the Revolution Society for the voice of England. Not one Englishman in 100, he insists, feels the triumph that Dr. Price felt. In one of his most vivid images, he compares the noisy few to insects in a summer field. Half a dozen grasshoppers under a fern make the field ring with their importunate chink, whilst thousands of great cattle, reposed beneath the shadow of the British oak, chew the cud and are silent. The English, he says, are not the converts of Rousseau, nor the disciples of Voltaire. Helvetius has made no progress among them, and the writings of the freethinkers who once attacked religion, men like Collins, Toland, Tyndall, and Bolingbroke, are already half forgotten. Instead, he declares in a sentence that gathers up his whole social creed, "We fear God, we look up with awe to kings, with affection to parliaments, with duty to magistrates, with reverence to priests, and with respect to nobility." From this he mounts his celebrated and deliberately provocative defense of prejudice. The English, he says, are generally men of untaught feelings, and far from being ashamed of their inherited attachments, they cherish them precisely because they are prejudices, because they carry the accumulated wisdom of generations without requiring each man to reason it out afresh. Rather than have every individual trade upon his own private stock of reason, which Burke thinks small in any single man, they prefer to draw upon the general bank and capital of nations and of ages. Prejudice, in his account, is not blind error. It is latent wisdom, tested by long experience and folded into instinct and habit, so that it stands ready for use in the very moment of decision, when there is no time for philosophy. Prejudice, he writes, renders a man's virtue his habit, and engages the mind and the affections together on the side of what is right. At the foundation of this whole settled order, Burke places religion. "We know," he writes, "that religion is the basis of civil society, and the source of all good and of all comfort. Man is, in his phrase, by his constitution a religious animal, and atheism, he predicts, is not only against reason, but against instinct, and cannot prevail for long. The establishment of the church is therefore, in his words, the first of our prejudices, not a prejudice destitute of reason, but one that contains a deep and profound wisdom. The state itself he regards as in a real sense consecrated, so that those who wield its power should feel that they act as in the great presence, and that they will one day render an account of their trust. This leads to his grandest redefinition of the social contract, and to a direct answer to the revolutionary idea that a people may dissolve and remake its government at will. Society, he says, is indeed a contract, but it is not to be understood on the model of a mere commercial bargain, a partnership agreement and a trade of pepper and coffee, to be taken up and dissolved at the fancy of the parties. It is a partnership in all science, a partnership in all art, a partnership in every virtue, and in all perfection. And because such ends cannot possibly be attained within a single lifetime, the partnership reaches across the generations. It becomes, in his celebrated words, a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. Each contract of a particular state is but a clause in the one great primeval contract of eternal society. Men who would tear up that contract at the bidding of the moment's will, he warns, would dissolve the bonds that hold the moral world together and cast society into the antagonist world of madness, discord, vice, confusion, and unavailing sorrow. Part 6. The Robbery of the Church. Burke now turns to what he regards as the central crime of the Revolution, the wholesale confiscation of the property of the Church. No honest public man in England, he says, fails to reprobate this dishonest, perfidious, and cruel confiscation by which the National Assembly seized the endowments of the clergy. He adds, with a shrewd eye to the effect at home, that the robbery of your church has proved a security to the possessions of ours. For the English, seeing plainly where such principles must lead, only cling the more firmly to property of every kind. He is contemptuous of the sophistry by which the revolutionaries had justified the seizure, the pretense that churchmen were merely fictitious persons, creatures of the state, holding at the state's pleasure property that the state might at any time resume. Even the great confiscators of history, he observes, a Marius or a Sylla in Rome, a Henry VIII despoiling the English abbeys, had at least sought the color of some justification, some form of law, or charge of crime. The French, he says with bitter economy, needed no such pretense. They required only one short form of incantation, philosophy, light, liberality, the rights of men. He then presses a further and, to him, decisive point, that the confiscation was not even financially necessary. By the finance minister Necker's own account, the deficiency in the French budget amounted to only some 56 millions of livres, a little over 2 millions sterling, a sum that a fair and general scheme of taxation could readily have met. The clergy and the nobility, he notes, already bore heavy public burdens, and the clergy, through the Archbishop of Aix, had actually offered a further voluntary contribution, which was refused. From this refusal, Burke draws his sharpest conclusion about the true aim of the whole proceeding. There was no desire that the church should be brought to serve the state. The service of the state was made a pretext to destroy the church. The real driving forces, he argues, lay elsewhere. In a great moneyed interest, swollen by speculation in the public debt, and jealous of the older landed nobility, which had made common cause with what he calls the political men of letters, a literary cabal gathered around the academies and the great encyclopedia, which had, in his view, formed a deliberate and settled plan for the destruction of the Christian religion, and had long corresponded with foreign princes toward that end. This alliance, he warns of obnoxious wealth to restless and desperate poverty, was the engine of the confiscation, and the plundered wealth of the church was to become the foundation of a compulsory paper currency and the sole resource of every one of the Revolution's operations in finance. Part 7. France was reformable. Against the revolutionary claim that the old regime had been an intolerable despotism, fit for nothing but demolition, Burke argues at length that pre-revolutionary France had in fact been a flourishing and eminently improvable country. He measures it by two standards. The first is population. Citing the estimates of the royal intendants of the various generalities, and the figures of Necker, he puts the population of France at more than 24 millions and steadily increasing, and he takes the crowded generality of Lisle, with its many hundred souls to the square league, as his strongest instance. A government under which the people multiply and the land fills, he argues, simply cannot be the very worst of governments, whatever its faults. His second standard is wealth. Here he grants that France was inferior to England in the distribution and rapid circulation of riches. But he surveys, with evident admiration, its great cities, its roads and bridges and canals, its ports and its navy, its agriculture and its manufactures, its charities and its long roll of men of learning, and finds in the whole something which awes and commands the imagination. This, he insists, was emphatically not the naked despotism of Turkey. The old government of France, he says, well deserved to have its excellencies heightened, its faults corrected, and its capacities improved into a British constitution. He mocks the revolutionaries for now reducing so rich a country to the condition of Swift's imaginary land of speculating projectors, where every ancient and useful thing is torn up to make room for some untried theory. He defends in turn the two orders that the revolution had painted as objects of horror. The French nobility, from his own personal observation on his travels, he had found to be high-spirited, honorable, and, on the whole, humane to their inferiors. To strike a servant, he notes, was among them a thing almost unknown. Their real faults were faults of manners and of a fashionable, licentious philosophy, not the crimes of tyrants. They were nothing like the marauding barons of an earlier Italy, or the military castes of the East, to which their enemies compared them. Whatever their failings, he insists, they had done nothing to merit destruction. Nobility, he writes, is a graceful ornament to the civil order. It is the Corinthian capital of polished society. And, he adds, to degrade is to punish, so that to strip the noblesse of their honors was to inflict a punishment upon men who had committed no crime. The clergy, too, he had found for the most part to be men of moderate minds and decorous manners, some of them worthy of a Fenelon. Throughout, he distrusts on principle those who first blacken the character of the people they intend to plunder. An enemy, he writes, is a bad witness. A robber is a worse. From all this, Burke draws the central maxim of his statesmanship, that destruction is easy and demands no talent whatever, while preservation joined to reform is the true and difficult work of the wise ruler. Rage and frenzy, he writes, will pull down more in half an hour than prudence, deliberation, and foresight can build up in 100 years. The genuine statesman does not undertake to regenerate a whole constitution at a single stroke, as a quack physician might promise to make a new man. Rather, in Burke's words, we compensate, we reconcile, we balance, working patiently with the materials that history has given us. Difficulty itself, he adds, is a benefit in disguise, for it forces thought and tempers rashness. Difficulty is a severe instructor, and, in his memorable phrase, our antagonist is our helper, since the very resistance we meet obliges us to understand what we are dealing with before we act. Burke lingers over the Assembly's contempt for what the lawyers call prescription, the principle that long, undisturbed possession confers a right, and warns that in throwing it over, the revolutionaries have unsettled the title to every kind of property, not merely the churches. Once the confiscation begins with the clergy, he notes, it does not stop there. Already the princes of the blood had been stripped of their estates and reduced to precarious pensions. The true danger, he insists, lies not in the identity of the first victims, but in the principle of injustice itself, which, once admitted, can be turned against any man in his turn. On the monasteries in particular, he confesses that he can scarcely separate policy from justice. Even granting that many monastic institutions had outlived their use, a wise statesman, he argues, would have found some better employment for so great a corporate revenue than simply selling it off. For to sell such an establishment, he says, is to sell their tools. He is willing to speak a word even for superstition in its milder forms. Superstition, he grants, is the religion of feeble minds. Yet the superstition that builds, that raises hospitals, endows libraries, and adorns a country with monuments is far more tolerable than the cold new zeal that only demolishes. Behind all of this lies his refusal to grant the Assembly any settled authority at all. He will consider it, he says, as nothing more than a voluntary association of men who have availed themselves of circumstances to seize upon the power of the state, a body with scarcely a year's prescription behind it, which in acquiring and keeping power follows the oldest formulas of usurpation, and in its public measures trusts everything to untried speculation. Burke is convinced, moreover, that the example of the French confiscation will not stay within France. The principle of injustice, once loosed, tends to spread, and he sees in the new societies that correspond across national borders the machinery of a general contagion. He recalls that England had known such fanaticism before, in the Long Parliament's seizure of the lands of deans and chapters, and he reaches further back to the Anabaptists of Munster, whose leveling zeal had once terrified Europe, as a warning of what happens when men persuade themselves that property is theirs to redistribute in the name of a higher cause. He foresees the revolutionary states drawn on by their paper schemes into ever greater extremity, wading deeper and deeper into an ocean of boundless debt, and creating at every step a discontented moneyed interest, whose fortunes depend upon the ruin of the old order, and who therefore have no interest in its recovery. He returns here to his defense of the church establishment as something woven into the whole fabric of English life rather than a burden upon it. In England, he observes, the education of the young is very largely in the hands of the clergy, and the estate of the church is not felt as a thing apart, but is identified in the public mind with the mass of private property, so that an attack upon the one is understood at once as a threat to the other. The English, he says, can see without pain or grudging an archbishop take precedence of a duke, or a bishop enjoy a great revenue, because they regard the dignity of the church as part of their own dignity and the security of its possessions as a pledge of the security of theirs. It is this quiet identification of the sacred with the settled, of religion with property and manners and law, that the French have torn apart, and Burke's fear is that, the principle once established that a great and ancient body of property may be seized upon a mere form of words, no possession anywhere in Europe can any longer count itself safe. Part 8. The Geometric Republic. In the last great movement of the book, Burke examines the actual machinery that the National Assembly had constructed, institution by institution, and he begins with its remaking of the country itself. The Assembly had swept away the old provinces, with their ancient names and loyalties and customs, and had redivided France by abstract measurement into 83 departments, subdivided again into communes and cantons, a scheme he treats with withering contempt as the work of a land surveyor with his chain and his theodolite, rather than of a statesman who understands human nature. The loyalty and affection of a people, he argues, cannot possibly fasten upon a description of square measurement. No man will feel for a numbered geometric district, laid out on a map, the love he feels for the province in which he and his fathers were born. Against the whole design, Burke sets one of his most enduring principles. We begin our public affections in our families, he writes, and then extend them by natural stages to our neighborhood and our province, so that these lesser attachments become, in his fine phrase, so many inns and resting places on the road that leads at last to the love of the whole country and of mankind. No cold relation, he adds, is a zealous citizen. A patriotism built downward from abstract theory, rather than outward from real affection, will have no roots and no warmth. He then examines in detail the scheme of representation founded upon this new division, a representation resting upon three separate bases: the territory, measured out geometrically, the population, counted arithmetically, and the amount of taxes paid, reckoned financially. Through patient arithmetic, he shows that the combination of these three principles produces gross and absurd inequalities between one citizen and another, and that the property qualifications imposed for voting and for office openly betray the very rights of men that the Assembly had proclaimed as the foundation of everything. Worse still, he argues, the elaborate system of indirect elections, with several removes interposed between the primary voters and the national deputies, severs the deputy entirely from the people he is supposed to represent, so that he comes to resemble not the representative of a nation, but the ambassador of a separate and distant state. The whole tendency of the design, Burke warns, is not to unite France but to break it apart, to sever France into a variety of republics, held together, if at all, only by force applied from the center. He commends to his reader the writings of the former minister Calonne, who had warned that the scheme was carrying France from a monarchy toward a mere loose confederacy of quarreling little states. Part 9. The Assignats and the Economy of Gaming. What, then, holds this deliberately fragmented country together? Burke argues that the Assembly relies upon certain artificial cements, and the first and chief of these is the confiscated wealth of the Church, converted into a compulsory paper currency, the assignats. He describes a strange and perpetual process, as he puts it, of transmutation of paper into land, and land into paper. Because this paper is not founded upon any real deposit of money, the management of it concentrates an enormous and unaccountable power in the hands of the few who direct its issue and circulation, creating, he warns, an oligarchy in every one of the republics. The revolutionaries, he says, are the very first who have founded a commonwealth upon gaming, and their true aim is to metamorphose France from a great kingdom into one great play table, where the fortunes of every family rise and fall with the fluctuations of a speculative paper. He compares the whole design to the notorious financial bubbles of an earlier age, to Law's Mississippi scheme in France, and to the South Sea bubble in England, and notes the cruelty of its working. The peasant, compelled to accept the depreciated paper at its full face value, finds it, in Burke's exact phrase, 7% the worse, merely for crossing the street to spend it. The end of the process, he predicts, is that all real power will drain away into the towns, into the hands of the burghers and the moneyed directors, producing an ignoble oligarchy founded on the destruction of the crown, the church, the nobility, and the people. For, as he sums it up, the many must be the dupes of the few who conduct the machine of these speculations. He returns to the signets again in his detailed survey of the Revolution's finances, and there he exposes what he regards as an outright fraud. The Assembly had solemnly declared, in April of 1790, that the confiscated church lands were free of all charges, and had then issued vast quantities of paper against them, as though against a clear estate. But drawing again upon the figures of Cologne, Burke shows that the charges and debts attached to those very lands, in fact, exceeded their whole income by millions of pounds a year. To every difficulty that arises, he observes with heavy irony, the revolutionaries have but a single monotonous answer: issue assignats. Their fanatical confidence in the omnipotence of church plunder, he says, treats the seized property as a universal medicine, a kind of philosopher's stone that will cure every disease of the state. They will even, he notes, melt down the very bells of the churches and call the coining of them a triumph of finance. He organizes his entire critique of their financial system around a single maxim: the revenue of the state is the state. And that revenue, by the Assembly's own reports, had already fallen by fully a third since the Revolution began, a loss he sets beside the boast of the mayor of Paris, M. Bay, who had praised the citizens for patiently bearing their distress, when in truth, Burke retorts, what they were bearing was the ruin brought upon them by their supposed benefits. Part 10. The Degraded King, the Courts, and the Army. Burke completes his institutional survey with the executive power, the judicature, and the army. The Assembly, he says, has chosen a degraded king, a monarch reduced to a machine, without any sort of deliberative discretion, stripped of the power to appoint the judges and of the power to bestow honors, for the judges are now to be elective and the rewards of the state are in other hands. The king is left as a mere instrument for carrying out harsh decrees that he had no share in making, and is even to be spattered, as Burke puts it, with the blood of his own people whenever those decrees are enforced. He can therefore call him, in bitter contempt, a chief of bumbailiffs, sergeants at mace, catchpoles, jailers, and hangmen. No executive so constituted, Burke argues, can possibly govern well, for real authority requires not merely obedience, but love and veneration, and neither can be commanded from a captive whose ministers serve him only through fear. He observes further that in reducing the king to a cipher, the Assembly has forgotten to constitute any Senate or Council to stand between the sovereign multitude and the executive, an omission in which, he says with sarcasm, their Solons and Numas have shown a sovereign incapacity. The judicature fares no better under his examination. The Assembly began, he notes, with the utter abolition of the parliaments. The old sovereign courts of France, which, whatever their faults of venality, had been genuinely independent, had steadily guarded private property, and had preserved, like the Areopagus of ancient Athens, the memory and the record of the Constitution, acting as a standing check upon the excesses of power. In their place are to come judges who are elective, temporary, and local, and who will therefore be, Burke predicts, partial, timid, and factional, in his flat verdict, the worst of all tribunals. But the gravest danger of all, he argues, lies in the army, and it is here that his prophecy is darkest. "You have got the wolf by the ears," he tells his correspondent. He quotes at length the alarming report of the war minister, Monsieur de la Tour de Pin, describing regiments fallen into turbulent anarchy, officers despised and imprisoned, commanders murdered by their own men. The soldiers, Burke observes dryly, have merely learned and acted upon the very doctrines that the assembly itself had been preaching to the whole nation: the rights of man, equality, the abolition of rank. An army that once begins to deliberate, in the war minister's own words that Burke seizes upon, becomes a military democracy, a species of political monster which has always ended by devouring those who have produced it. Because the revolutionaries have systematically destroyed every prejudice and every sentiment that once supported civil authority, they must, Burke argues, come in the end to rule by naked force. And yet they have poisoned the very army upon which that rule must depend. From this chaos, he foresees, some popular general will one day rise, and in the passage so often read as an uncanny anticipation of Napoleon, the person who really commands the army is your master, the master of your king, the master of your assembly, the master of your whole republic. He notes, too, the peculiar way in which the confiscated lands were disposed of. They were not truly sold in any ordinary sense, for ready money the revolutionaries did not have. They were handed over, as Burke puts it, to philosophic purchasers who bought without capital, receiving land on credit and paying for it in the very paper the scheme had created. The old sovereign courts, having been abolished, saw their lawyers compensated for their vanished offices in the same depreciated paper, so that the men of law were made, whether they would or not, partners in the fortunes of the assignat. The whole design, Burke argues, thus binds an ever-widening circle of citizens to the success of the confiscation, giving them a stake in preventing any restoration of what has been destroyed, which is precisely, he suspects, why it was contrived so. In all of this, Burke insists, the revolutionaries have mistaken arithmetic for wisdom and measurement for justice, treating living men as so many equal units to be counted, divided, and assigned, when in truth, the art of government begins precisely where such calculation ends. Burke dwells on why a degraded executive must fail, drawing his evidence from history. A monarch, he argues, cannot infuse energy and vigor into measures he knows to have been dictated by men who hate him. He recalls how Louis XIII bore the overbearing Richelieu, how Louis XIV worked through a Mazarin and a Louvois, and how, nearer home, George II took the elder Pitt into his service, though he had no love for the man, because in every case the minister served, however roughly, in trust for the crown and the state, not as its jailer. A king who is made the mere clerk of an assembly that despises him has no such motive of honor to offer, and can command nothing but the sullen service of fear. Nor, he adds, can the education of the heir mend matters. If the young Dauphin is taught to conform to his degraded situation, he will have no education at all, and if he is taught anything worthy of his birth, nature itself will one day drive him to avenge his parents. Whilst you pique nature against you, Burke warns, you do unwisely to trust to duty. He turns then to the strange spectacle of a state maintaining, as he puts it, two governments at once, one real, one fictitious, the show of a monarchy over the reality of the assembly's power, both of them costly, and the useless one the more costly of the two, so that the whole contrivance, in his phrase, is not worth the grease of its wheels. The new municipal army he treats as another such monster, a purely democratic force, its officers chosen at the pleasure of the districts, coherent enough in itself, but, when set in any relation to the crown, the assembly, or the regular army, a thing without precedent and without stability, worse than the loose confederations of the ancient world. On the finances he is unsparing. He mocks the voluntary benevolence by which citizens were invited, upon their honor, to surrender a fourth part of their income, a scheme he calls a tax of regulation upon virtue, which in practice made, as he says, one man's security for another's patriotism. He notes the depreciation of the assignats by 5 and 7%, the forced purchases of specie, and the Assembly's swaggering declaration that its paper was the equal of gold and silver. A boast, he observes dryly, that is powerful in the debating chamber, but impotent in the market. And he ends this survey with a warning drawn from antiquity. Paris, he says, now stands in the place of ancient Rome, a single dominant city drawing its subsistence from subject provinces. It has reduced to dependence, the very combination that, in the ancient world, helped bring the mistress of nations to her ruin. Closing. Liberty, wisdom, and the disposition to preserve. Burke gathers his whole verdict into a question about the nature of liberty itself. Liberty, he freely grants, is a great and precious good. But liberty considered alone, uncontrolled by wisdom and by virtue, is worthless, and may be far worse than worthless. What is liberty without wisdom and without virtue, he asks. It is the greatest of all possible evils, for it is folly, vice, and madness, without tuition or restraint. To grant men mere unrestrained freedom is the easiest thing in the world. It requires nothing, he says, but to let go the rein. But to form a genuinely free government, one that holds liberty and restraint in a just and lasting balance, that gives energy to power while keeping it obedient to law, requires a sagacious, powerful, and combining mind. And this, Burke charges, is precisely what the leaders of the assembly wholly lack. They are, in his contemptuous phrase, mere bidders at an auction of popularity, working in an atmosphere in which moderation will be stigmatized as the virtue of cowards, and every man is driven to outbid his rival in extremity. He is willing to allow that they may here and there have done some good, but his settled judgment is that, quote, their improvements are superficial, their errors fundamental, and that whatever was genuinely beneficial in their measures had, for the most part, already been freely offered by the king himself before ever they seized their power. He closes by commending to his own countrymen the British Constitution as an invaluable treasure to be reverenced and, where necessary, repaired, but never to be flung away in exchange for the abstract models of France. He would not, he is careful to say, exclude all change whatsoever, but in a phrase that distills his whole philosophy of reform, even when I changed, it should be to preserve. Any necessary repair he would make in his fine architectural image, in the style of the building, and in the spirit of ancestors who acted always under, quote, a strong impression of the ignorance and fallibility of mankind. France, he warns his young correspondent, having chosen the path of total demolition, must now pass through great varieties of untried being, and be, in his grim closing prophecy, purified by fire and blood. He ends with a portrait of himself, and of the temper of mind the whole book has been recommending. He is, he writes, one who has been no tool of power, no flatterer of greatness, whose whole public exertion has been a struggle for the liberty of others, in whose breast anger has been kindled only by what he took to be tyranny, and who has sought little in the way of honors and expected nothing at all. He wishes above everything, he says, to preserve consistency. But who would preserve consistency by varying his means to secure the unity of his end? And he gives that thought its final image. Like a man who shifts the small weight of his reasons from side to side of a vessel to keep it in equipoise, he will carry his own weight of argument to whichever side of the ship of state is for the moment rising too high, so that the whole may be preserved in balance. With that picture of the statesman as one who is forever trimming the vessel of the Commonwealth toward stability, changing, when he must, only in order to conserve, Burke's long letter comes to its close.